Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Retail Doctor Group CEO Summit on the State of the Nation. My name is Anastasia Lloyd-Wallace. I am the head of the Consumer Insights Division for Retail Doctor Group. We've got a great panel of speakers this morning, and I'll pass over to Brian.
Good morning, Anastasia, and thank you very much for attending our first digital CEO breakfast. And of course, the State of the Nation, as we're calling it, and it will be part of a series. This morning, we're delighted to welcome our guests. We're lucky to have Russell Zimmerman with us, Executive Director, National Retail, and the Australian Retail Association. He will take us through an overview of the Australian retail scene and how the key issues around COVID-19. I just wanted to start, if I could this morning, very briefly, to give a bit of a sort of global context, as it were. So we've reached out to our Ebeltoft partners. Those who know us, you would know that Retail Doctor Group is part of a global network. And there were really two reasons for this. One was to say that clearly we're not alone. And two, to give a bit of a sense of what's going on around the world. And this chart we can send out to all the participants. But as you could start to see, shopping centres globally very much impacted on, and the vast majority are closing or in the post of closing. There is retail open. It tends to be naturally the essential services of retail. And in some countries, people are just simply not allowed to leave the house. So Romania comes to mind, South Africa. And so you can see by this slide alone, this is very much a global pandemic, and retailers locally and globally are feeling the pressure of this. And of course, what is interesting is that we see global changes moving into online retail, and Matthew will touch on this. And this is fairly self-explanatory. What we do see is high growth in online, obviously, commoditized retail in particular, a lot of logistics problems, supply channel problems, but we're seeing very strong growth, and I suppose a re-education of many consumers. I looked briefly here at India, massive scale, online is struggling to keep pace with the orders, starting to restrict delivery services. And the Romanians, our friends in Romania, brands are moving direct to customers, cutting out the retail middleman. So all various retailer responses to this topic as they move online. This was an interesting piece of work from McKinsey. And what it talked about was consumer optimism being higher at the start and end life stages of the contagion. And what you actually see here, and I thought was quite interesting, was a fairly high degree of optimism in some of the major markets. China is the standout. Great deal of uncertainty, as we all know, and that's prevalent in every country in this little sample. And of course, pessimism, and funnily enough, you'll see in a couple of slides, Chinese are starting to prepare to go back to work, and their pessimism ratio is much lower, but probably as a consequence. Spain and Italy, two of the hotspots for the pandemic, regrettably in Europe, are naturally more pessimistic as an outcome. So, but we do see this preparation over the next weeks to months about what we'll start to talk about is how retailers will rebound from this. This slide really just shows how the Chinese are looking at changing their time, the way they're using time differently. But again, you can start to see an increase in their expected time allocation as they start to have a view that they're coming back into the workforce, starting to return. We also see significant increases in, naturally enough, online shopping, a more isolated environment. But overall, what's key here is this move, if you like, to starting to think about coming back into the world that we knew. And this really makes that point. China is heading back to work. So extremely low rate of pessimism to this McKinsey chart, and showing a high level, relatively high level of optimism. And I think you'll find that next week to 3 to 4 weeks, that optimism will be at a greater level, ratio, and uncertainty will start to decrease, which is no more really than an indicator that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Well, Italy has been a very well documented and very sad case of the real critical effects of this pandemic. And this really just shows us briefly about the uncertainty about the economy in the Italian marketplace, preventing them from making purchases or investments that otherwise make. And so very much a frugal approach, as you'd expect, lockdown approach, very frugal, and a large sentiment about uncertainty, very strong, and certainly very, very high sense of being affected by this pandemic. This came from our English partners overnight. This is from the group at Pragma. What I thought was interesting with that piece was when we look at this, we see how this question, how long consumers expect issues to last, and you see, you know, a large sense of in the UK, spending diverted very much into online again. At 24%, nearly 25% of shoppers have changed how they shop since the UK government started enacting coronavirus-related stay-at-home measures. So big move online, almost a complete lockdown, particularly in London. And so you see changing in consumer patterns as a consequence. This is some work that Anastasia and the team are really starting to look at as we move into tracking consumers. Now, Anastasia, if you're there, did you want to comment on that? Okay.
Sorry, Brian, just dealing that. Yeah, so what we're, I suppose, seeing here is the 1 in 2 Australian consumers have not had an impact from COVID-19 as yet, which I do see as very much a positive aspect. And we're even seeing 8% of the population saying that they're actually seeing an increase in the discretionary income. So I think from a retail point of view, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's always good to understand how this is affecting customers and talk to them to really understand what this means to them. What we then did is we actually then asked them how it's affecting them by category in Australia as well. So again, while we can see which categories will have the largest impact, this really helps retailers understand very much where they should be preparing and where they should be aiming their guns. What we saw in the previous slide is we're seeing obviously younger consumers being more impacted and very much female consumers being more impacted. So I think if you're a retailer, in particularly in one of the higher impacted categories with a target consumer of female or younger consumers, you can really understand how you can shift your offer and how you can shift your focus to really gain a bit more traction during this period.
Thank you. All right. Now this was IKEA, and it was just an example coming out of Spain in particular, and some of the other European countries where they're starting to convert physical space increasingly into e-commerce fulfillment centers. And so contactless, no human contact, mobile app supporting. So what we do see, and what we saw in a lot of the notes overnight from our colleagues, was retailers either changing production, such as Inditex Zara producing hospital scrubs for the Spanish hospitals, through to making other businesses making ventilators and the like. So, I mean, I think that's particularly pleasing. It just shows a little bit of adaptation. As does Aldi coming up through the Europe, again, thinking about the workers, the front line, if you like, providing specialized access time, thinking about their model slightly differently. And this one Anastasia, do you want to jump in? Because this is from Andrea, Romania, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is an example of a Romanian brand actually changing the way that they operate. And what they've done is they've actually, in the 2 months, sort of in the last 4 weeks, actually developed a direct-to-consumer model. So this was a water company that is really getting their brand direct to consumers. So it's just another way of a retailer thinking about this just a little bit differently and really acting very quickly in the short space of time to see what they can do to really thrive and keep going through this period.
What I think we would obviously see pre-COVID was a lot of manufacturers, suppliers doing direct to market and online portals and pop-ups and the like. I think that is being accentuated through this period and will continue post-COVID. Okay. So now it's about being innovative, adaptive, and so really, as I start to move to Russell, I think it's a great moment just to think about our retail sector. I think in some ways, as Anastasia points out, we are really moving towards the peak of this. But it seems, if the Chinese sector is any guide, that the recovery might not be as prolonged. However, the shape of the curve will be interesting. And both Joel, I'm sure, and Russell will touch on the economic implications of the government subsidy as a consequence.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to have to keep this fairly brief because unfortunately I've got to go to a government round table. A couple of things I really want to pick up on there. So if you look at the state of the industry at the moment, I think it's fair to say that it's almost a 2 or 3 speed economy in retail. You've got people like supermarkets booming, obviously, but interestingly enough, got people in the electrical field, in iPads, computers, that type of thing, doing really well. Then you've got white goods like freezers, bread makers. Those items are doing exceptionally well. And books, interestingly enough, are also doing very well. And all of that is around people getting ready to nest at home. The other thing that's doing very well, obviously, is equipment to work from home. So we're seeing a lot of IT equipment being bought, and we expect that to get very short in the marketplace very soon. Some of the modelling that we're seeing done is we reckon it might be a hit to the GDP of around 25%, a reduction of about 25%. To the point that one of your slides there was, Brian, what's the recovery going to look like? Well, I think unfortunately what we're going to really see is a very, very slow return. And the reason I say that is because when retailers open up, I don't think they're going to open up in the same way. People are still going to be scared to come out for a while, and it will take a long while for consumers to get back into the normal pattern of going back into the shops. So what I think you'll see is an incredibly big reliance on online. I just want to really quickly go over some of the things that the association's being lobbied on and some of the things we're talking to government about. So the first one's probably by no surprise to anybody, and that is what are critical retail industries. And it's quite surprising when you hear some of the people that are really lobbying for that. But that's certainly an area that we're getting hits on all the time and saying our industry is very important. One of the big problems has been the lack of clarity from government. So even this morning, if you look on your social media, you may well find instances of people saying, well, can I actually go to the shop and buy, say, something that's not considered as an essential service? So can I go and get the kids' shoes, or can I go and get some winter clothing that's starting to get cool? And they are uncertain as to what they can and can't do. So government messaging is really a difficulty at the moment, and it's not making things very easy. Other things we're being lobbied on: freight costs. Retailers are starting to look about how they're going to get goods out from overseas, particularly things that are in short supply. Freight costs have gone up through the roof, and that's a huge issue. One of the other problems is getting stuff across our borders. To give an example, if you have something that's of a nature that might be I'm going to say perfumes and things like that that are considered inflammable. You've got to have different documentations to get them between borders across states. If you're flying them, you can't fly certain products, and that's fair enough. Although products that you can fly in from overseas, you can't necessarily, you can get to Australia, but you can't fly domestically, and there's reasons for that. A lot of retailers, we think, have got some big problems coming up in the fashion area, because we don't know how long we're going to be closed down for. And if they're closed down for, say, 2 or 3 months, what's that going to do to their fashion stock moving forward? Because by the time they reopen, they'll have winter stock, with summer stock sort of about to come in the door, and they won't have had time to shift their stock, even though they've been selling online. One of the other big areas is we're being lobbied by retailers to ensure that they can have what we would call dark stores. And by dark stores, I'm simply saying that if you're in a shopping centre, can you have your store open to have a number of staff in there to do pick and pack and have it ready for collection? A lot of retailers use their stores within shopping centres as part of their online delivery. Another big issue that's coming up in the industry is that there are varying retailers, I'll call them vertical retailers, that have sell as a retailer but also have wholesale brands. They're having orders cancelled. I heard of one the other day with over $1 million order being cancelled. That's going to really hit on those retailers. Interesting enough, retail theft is rising. I don't suppose that's any real amazement to anybody, but yes, it is. And I've also told the break-ins are increasing. A couple of things we've worked on. Obviously, if those of you who have been watching the media will have seen the work we did with the SDA, and in particular to deliver the industry rescue package, as we called it. I think the government has delivered on part of that, and we're probably pretty happy with the package. There are some issues in it that we need to work through with government. I can say to you, I'm talking to government virtually on a daily basis, and certainly attending a lot of roundtables. The other one, and Simon, when he gets to his point, he might like to make some other comments on this, but we felt it was important to try and get some consistency, particularly across the states. You would all realise that leasing is a state-based issue, and the government was grappling with trying to come up with something that would work. We have put out yesterday a media release and a set of principles, I would call them, on what we agree with should be moving forward. Now, I'm sure the retailers all on the line would be dearly hoping that we have managed to get all landlords to agree to a major reduction. We can't. That is an individual situation you've all got to go and work through individually, but there are a number of other principles in that, and I'm happy to share that to Brian, and he can share that to the group to what that is. Look, the other things that I think are probably really showing their at the moment, our employment law division, and I'm sure that Belinda will talk about this, our employment law division has been absolutely bombarded with phone calls with people trying to understand what they can do and what they can't do. And they were very worried about standing down before the government actually closed retail, which the government hasn't done naturally. And there were some concerns about whether they could or couldn't do that and what the view is on that. We're trying to seek some clarity from government on that still, even though most retailers are closed. That's something we're still working on. Price gouging, there's been a lot of messaging around the industry about price gouging, and every radio shock jock wants to ask you why Coles and Woolworths are charging $11.99 a kilo for broccoli. Let me tell you, the costs in the supply chain have gone up drastically. And by that, I'm talking about the fact that, yes, we asked for deliveries to be able to be done virtually 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That entails truck drivers being paid at penalty rates when they're delivering outside of the block-out hours. In other words, from about 10 o'clock at night time through till early hours of the morning, which was traditionally a block-out. Those truck drivers are being paid a penalty rate. As we'd all be aware, Coles and Woolworths are probably one of the few retailers around that are engaging and getting more staff and in big numbers, and so that is a cost to them because they need more staff to run it. And I think probably the last thing is that there's been some blockages on wharves trying to get essential goods in from overseas, and we're trying to see how we can get the government to prioritise what we would call essential goods. And the problem is that everybody, or a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people see their goods as being essential. So a lot of things all over that we're trying to work on. But I think it's fair to say the government, under some very difficult pressures, has done a fairly good job on getting together the packages and trying to sort out where we should move forward from here. Finally, and Brian, you've touched on it. I think if you're a retailer and you're not online, I think quite frankly you're not in business any longer, and that's probably really where it comes down to. So.
And Russell, thank you for that. One quick question, if I may, before we pass to two other questions, conscious of your time. One of our clients was talking to us yesterday about what is an essential service. It seems
What's an essential service?
Seems to be some grayness around that.
Well, and this is where the difficulty is. Let me give you a bit of an overview of where I've been lobbied. So books, electrical, hardware, tobacco stores, because tobacco is an addiction, obviously supermarkets and delicatessens, butchers, pharmacy, online, dark stores, the fruit and vegetables. They're probably the main ones that have come up. But the government's taken a really interesting view on what's an essential service. And if you listen to what Josh Frydenberg has actually said, and the Prime Minister has very clearly said, and you can understand where the government's coming from. They actually want retail businesses to remain open wherever they can. Now, for some of those businesses, it's obviously not viable for you to stay open, and we've seen that with the large number of closures. But what they're trying to say is, if you're in work, it's an essential service. So if you can keep that shop open, and if it's profitable to do so, that's exactly what they want to do. I actually spoke to the Treasurer last night, and I'm going to say when I spoke to the Treasurer and the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Suker, as well, in a conversation. And one of the things I think they're probably a little bit disappointed about is that there was a number of retailers that as soon as the package was released on Monday night, on Tuesday made a decision to close down. They would actually prefer to see businesses wherever they're possible and wherever social distancing is possible to remain open, providing it's profitable. They actually want that to happen because obviously every business that closes means that they're subsidising more and more wages. So it's probably not possible for a lot of businesses to remain open, but if you can, that's what they really want you to do.
Appreciate that, Russell. Great answer.
We've got a question coming here from David Light. Just to clarify, if possible, a store is allowed to have a gathering. So how many people are allowed in a store of, say, 500 square metres? Is there any steadfast rules there? Do we know?
Look, this comes down to a sensible position, not so much anything else. So I noticed, for instance, that Bunnings are allowing 4 people in an alleyway. A really good move. I'm just sort of trying to work out what they're doing. If you think about a Bunnings alleyway, what they're doing with the side alleyways. And I don't know whether there's any Bunnings people on the phone, but if there is, it'd be really interesting. I'll be talking to them tomorrow. But look, essentially what you've got to try and do is to keep the 1.5 metre rule, or preferably the 4 metre rule. Now, the 4 metre rule is probably almost impossible to do, but it's going to depend upon the size of your shop. I noticed I went to my local butcher on the weekend, and he's allowing 3 people into the store, and the rest of us were standing. And admittedly, it is a retail store on a strip area. It's not in a shopping centre. So what he was doing was allowing people to 3 people into the shop. And, you know, if you had kids, you asked your kids to wait outside. As one person walked out, another person could walk in. And he was even down to the fact of try not to come in as a couple, but, you know, the person who's doing the shopping come in and the other one remain out. So, you know, you've got to use logical sense, but essentially it's really somewhere between the 1.5 and the 4 metre square rule. And that's the best I can answer.
Great, thanks for that, Russell. That's perfect. And I think we've got Mike who wants to ask a verbal question to Brian, possibly. Mike, if you're there, you can talk now.
Yeah, hi, Brian.
I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go. Apologies, everyone.
Thanks, Russell.
Okay, thank
you very much, Russell, for your work there. Fantastic. Mike, go ahead.
Certainly. Sorry, one moment. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. What my question was, how do we handle community? Because in a lot of retailers, you know, there's a component there of physical, you know, visiting that physical store as a part of a community. So the greater the frequency, the greater the purchase intent. So how do you maintain that online? You know, because obviously you don't have that physical experience. Yeah, how do you maintain that community?
Okay, well, if that's a general question, I might pass through to Matthew, who does a lot of our work. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer it.
No, we can pass it through to Matthew. That sounds good.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really good question, actually, and I think it's a lot of the time people think that the only way to engage a community at a certain level of depth is through that physical interaction. But you'll see a lot of pure play stores online that only do online sales that build really, really strong communities. A good example of an Australian retailer probably be Shopo. You've seen them over the years build extremely strong community, and their business is built on their community of loyal consumers. And obviously it's a different ballgame in terms of what the physical store might do. It's going to be to do with things like social. How do you engage better on social? Creating the right, I guess, email engagement strategy, making sure that the products are matching what the consumers are wanting, and the whole, I guess, a mix of things. So I think it's really changing the mindset on how to engage community.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I would add to that, it's a segmented approach as well. So the community is a sum of parts, understanding the consumer types, profiles, and building really relevant messaging and offer to them. The idea of all customers are the same would be the first flaw in the approach. Community is an aggregate of individual profiles. So good retailers know that, and Mike, they tune their messaging accordingly.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of opportunity in the digital engagement space to do things at scale, leveraging automation, but weaving in interesting personalization techniques. So you can do a lot more engagement digitally with less of a footprint in terms of you know, the actual labor it takes to make it work, which is also positive. And this can also kind of complement your physical community. You know, even if we were in a normal retail environment, I think doing digital engagement effectively can really complement the physical space.
We've got some examples of some clients who working with us have done exactly that. They've gone through their database. They've really kept very, very close with very specific messaging and building into relationships in that community and keeping close to them through the process, through this journey. So great question, Mike. Thank you.